How could just 500 men bring down an empire that was home to millions? The conquest of the New World was not an easy march by Spaniards clad in steel. It was an exhausting war on the brink of total annihilation. Hernán Cortés's expedition began with an open mutiny.
In the spring of 1519, Spanish ships dropped anchor off the coast of Mexico.
There was no way back. To stop panic among the soldiers, Cortés gave a brutal order to sink and burn their own ships. The fire destroyed the fleet, leaving the conquistadors with only one path: forward. The expedition found itself completely isolated. All around lay unexplored jungles and the lands of hostile tribes.
Every decision the commander made could now cost the entire expedition its lives.
Soon the conquistadors would see the greatest city of the New World, but this marvel of engineering would quickly turn into a deadly trap for them.
Keep the pace steady! Watch the flanks, they could be anywhere!
The fire on the shore had finally died out. About 500 Spanish infantrymen and 16 horsemen were left alone on the edge of a vast continent. Without their ships, the conquistadors had no chance of retreat. This was no longer an exploratory expedition, but a brutal battle for survival. Hernán Cortés's detachment slowly moved deeper into the uncharted lands. The path led through dense tropical jungles and steep mountain passes. There were no familiar supply trains. The soldiers had to feed on roots, hunt on the go, and drink from murky forest streams. Every kilometer of the march drained their last ounce of strength. Heavy steel helmets and cuirasses became scorching hot under the blazing Mexican sun. The metal armor literally turned into a furnace.
The Spaniards lost vast amounts of fluid and collapsed to the ground from heat stroke.
Thick, damp undergrowth limited visibility to 2 or 3 meters. The detachment marched in a state of constant nervous tension. Arrows from an unknown enemy could fly at the soldiers from behind any tree. The advance guard, armed with swords, cut a narrow corridor through a solid wall of vines so that the column would not get bogged down in the deadly swamps. Cortés drove the army forward without long stops. It was the only way to prevent the local tribes from gathering large forces for an attack. Overnight stops turned into the construction of temporary fortresses. The conquistadors arranged their cannons in a circular formation, slept in their armor, and waited every second for a nighttime massacre. Meanwhile, their cover had long since been blown.
Indian scouts were tracking the Spaniards' every move.
Swift messengers were already racing along the mountain trails toward the Aztec capital, the great Tenochtitlan. Emperor Montezuma was informed of the arrival of the bearded men on the floating mountains. Tales of rumbling cannons and enormous horses sowed panic among the locals. Cortés skillfully exploited this primal fear to paralyze the will of the Indians. Every day brought the conquistadors closer to the heart of the wealthy empire. It seemed that the intimidation strategy was working perfectly. However, the expedition soon reached the borders of the warlike state of Tlaxcala, and this massive army was not intimidated in the least by steel swords or firearms.
They are trapped! Destroy them! Hold the line! Protect the horses!
But this story takes an unexpected turn. Hernán Cortés's true weapon was not steel swords, but the hatred of others. The Aztec Empire was held together by constant fear. Emperor Montezuma brutally punished the disobedient and collected enormous tribute. Hundreds of cities sent gold, corn, and captives for sacrifice to the capital.
500 Spaniards could not destroy such a colossus on their own. They needed an army.
Soon the conquistadors entered the lands of the independent state of Tlaxcala. They were met by tens of thousands of fierce Native American warriors. Fierce, bloody battles raged for several days. Spanish cannons mowed down the ranks of the attackers, while heavy cavalry crushed the infantry. The Tlaxcalan leaders quickly realized they could not defeat the Spaniards in open battle, so they made an unexpected decision. The Indians offered Cortés a military alliance against their main enemy, Emperor Montezuma. To seal the agreement, Cortés staged a demonstration. Heavy cannons roared, blasting targets to smithereens. Cavalry clad in the steel thundered across the field. The Tlaxcalans froze in terror. Now they believed that these strange people were truly capable of destroying the invincible Tenochtitlan. News of the new powerful alliance spread throughout Mexico. Rebellions broke out instantly in the provinces. Local residents seized and killed the tribute collectors from the capital. Gold and food no longer flowed into Montezuma's palace. Now these resources fed Cortez's growing army. The conquistadors marched resolutely toward the Aztec capital.
Behind Cortez were not only his soldiers, but also thousands of armed Tlaxcalan warriors.
The combined army burned hostile settlements and cut off trade routes. Montezuma was rapidly losing power. Soon the army approached a vast lake and saw the great Tenochtitlan. But it was too early to rejoice. The city itself was built in such a way that at any moment it could become a deadly trap for the invaders. On November 8, 1519, the Spaniards stood frozen in amazement. Before them lay Tenochtitlan, a vast city built right in the middle of a saltwater lake. More than 200,000 people lived in the Aztec capital. Cortez's detachment slowly stepped onto the stone causeway, stretching for many kilometers. It was the only road leading from the mainland to the metropolis. Water lapped at the soldiers' very feet. The Spanish cavalry and infantry marched in a tight column. It was physically impossible to veer off to the side or reform the ranks for battle.
Every few hundred meters, the stone road was interrupted by deep water channels.
The Aztecs had thrown wide wooden bridges across them. The conquistadors walked across them and realized with horror a simple truth. If the Indians removed these planks, the army would be cut off from the mainland forever. Cortez led his men into the very heart of Tenochtitlan. Emperor Montezuma housed the Spaniards in a huge stone palace, but the sense of security vanished the very next day. The officers surveyed the streets and grasped the scale of the threat. In the narrow alleys, the Spaniards lost their main advantage.
Heavy cannons could not fire through the dense buildings.
The damp lake air constantly ruined the precious gunpowder, and their supply of lead bullets was dwindling before their eyes. 500 Spaniards found themselves trapped in an island labyrinth. Surrounding them were hundreds of thousands of warriors loyal to Montezuma. The tension within the stone walls grew with every passing minute, and soon Cortez took a desperate step to avoid falling victim to this trap.
Hurry up, move it along.
Watch the pottery there. We need that intact for the captain.
Sitting in the palace and waiting for an attack was madness, so Hernán Cortés took an incredibly bold step. Armed Spanish officers entered Emperor Montezuma's private chambers. They threatened him with swords and took the ruler hostage right in the center of his own capital. Thus, 500 conquistadors came to rule a vast empire without ever leaving the stone fortress. A frightened Montezuma regularly appeared before the people and obediently issued the orders the Spaniards demanded. Life in the metropolis continued outwardly. The Indians still brought fresh food and hundreds of gold ornaments to the palace. The greed of Cortez's soldiers grew with each passing day. They smashed sacred Native American artifacts and melted them down into heavy ingots. The palace cellars quickly filled with treasures. However, these riches were quietly turning into a deadly burden. If the army had to fight its way through the narrow causeways, tons of gold would simply drag the men to the bottom of the Salt Lake. Meanwhile, a violent uprising was brewing in the streets of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec high priests and military commanders had lost faith in their emperor. They could clearly see that their great leader had become nothing more than a submissive puppet in the hands of the Spaniards. Secret councils began in the dark halls of the pyramids. The military leaders were no longer willing to endure the humiliation. They began secretly gathering tens of thousands of warriors and preparing weapons for a massive massacre. Cortés held the metropolis only through sheer audacity and fear for Montezuma's life. But this illusion of control was about to shatter into pieces. Disaster was already closing in on the conquistadors, and from a completely unexpected direction. Hernán Cortés temporarily left Tenochtitlan, leaving Captain Pedro de Alvarado in his place. This decision proved fatal for the entire Spanish expedition. In May 1520, thousands of noble Aztecs gathered in the main square to perform a sacred dance in honor of the god Huitzilopochtli. Alvarado completely lost his nerve at the sight of the huge crowd of Indians armed with ritual knives. Fearing a sudden uprising and a conspiracy against the garrison, he ordered his men to immediately attack the unarmed crowd. The Spanish conquistadors quickly blocked all exits from the square and carried out a brutal massacre there. The soldiers indiscriminately hacked down nobles and priests with their swords, who had not expected an attack during the festival. Screams of terror echoed throughout the vast city, sparking a wave of public outrage. Within a few hours, the cream of the Aztec aristocracy had been almost completely wiped out. This act of treachery forever altered the locals' attitude toward the newcomers from across the ocean. The blood spilled on the sacred steps of the Great Temple forever destroyed the fragile peace between the two peoples. The capital of the empire instantly erupted with fury and a thirst for immediate revenge. Hundreds of thousands of Indians took up spears and bows, forgetting their former fears of the white gods. A huge enraged crowd formed a tight ring around the stone palace of Ahuyacontl. It was there that the small Spanish garrison had barricaded itself, relying on the strength of the walls. The Aztecs acted decisively and cut off the supply of fresh water and food to the besieged building. The city's canals filled with boats carrying warriors, ready to launch a decisive assault at any moment. In just a few hours, the peaceful and prosperous metropolis on the lake had turned into a deadly trap for the Europeans. The conquistadors found themselves locked inside a stone bag with not the slightest hope of outside help. Hunger and thirst became their constant companions during those difficult days. Cortés, having returned with reinforcements from the coast, tried by any means to stop the carnage that had begun. He brought the captive Emperor Montezuma II out onto the high roof of the palace. The ruler called on his people to immediately lay down their weapons and return to their homes for the sake of general peace. However, the crowd no longer wished to believe their former leader and considered him a pitiful puppet in the hands of the enemy. The Indians chose a new leader for themselves and no longer obeyed the orders of the old monarch. A thick hail of heavy stones, sharp arrows, and spears flew toward the emperor. One of the stones struck Montezuma directly in the head, inflicting a fatal wound in full view of everyone. The mortally wounded ruler collapsed onto the stone slabs, and the Spaniards carried his body inside. Diplomacy had finally come to an end, giving way to open and merciless war of annihilation. Now both sides understood that only one of them would emerge alive from this city. The Indians methodically tightened the siege ring around the palace, giving the enemy not a moment's rest. The Aztecs quickly dismantled the wooden bridges and built massive stone barricades in the narrow streets. Any sortie by the Spanish cavalry into the open ended in complete failure. War horses broke their legs on the ruined pavement and the slippery stones of the embankments. Heavy objects and javelins rained down incessantly on the soldiers' heads from the flat roofs of neighboring houses. Cortés's soldiers bled out every day and slowly died of exhaustion and starvation. Supplies of gunpowder and crossbow bolts were running low, while the enemy's onslaught only intensified. Remaining within the palace walls any longer meant certain and agonizing death at the hands of fanatical warriors. Cortés realized the scale of the disaster and made the only decision possible in that situation: to flee. This plan was an act of utter desperation and the last chance to save what remained of the army. Under cover of night, the Spanish army had to break through a narrow causeway across Lake Texcoco to the mainland. Dark water lapped at the fugitives' feet, and for miles around there was not a single place to take cover. Any delay on the narrow path could lead to the complete destruction of the entire unit. The conquistadors understood that they had no room for error. Their entire campaign now depended on luck and the speed of their movement in the dark. Preparations for the breakthrough took place in complete darkness and under the strictest secrecy within the palace courtyard. Spanish carpenters hastily knocked together a huge portable wooden bridge out of beams and planks. With its help, the conquistadors hoped to quickly cross the destroyed canals on their way to the shore. Meanwhile, the rank-and-file soldiers greedily stuffed their pockets and armor with heavy gold bars from the treasury. Greed overcame fear, turning every soldier into a clumsy and slow target for the enemy. At midnight on June 30th, 1520, a heavy downpour began, muffling the sound of footsteps. The heavily armed column quietly left the palace gates and moved toward the nearest dam. The Spaniards cautiously stepped onto the wet and slippery stones of the first crossing. Ahead lay long kilometers of black water and uncertainty, but the silence of the sleeping city was suddenly shattered by the piercing and eerie rumble of an Indian drum. They had been spotted. The stealth of the maneuver did not last long, and the element of surprise was completely lost. The rumble of the Aztec signal drums instantly shattered the night silence and roused thousands of warriors. War cries rang out from the surface of the lake, approaching the dam from all sides. Elite jaguar warriors and eagle warriors raced toward the narrow road in hundreds of light boats. A deadly hail of stones, arrows, and copper axes rained down on the dense ranks of the Spaniards. The unit's organized retreat instantly turned into a chaotic and bloody struggle for survival. At the very first deep breach in the dam, Cortez's carefully devised plan collapsed completely. The heavy portable bridge, weighed down by cannons and armored horsemen, became firmly stuck in the sticky silt. The soldiers frantically tried to move it, but all their efforts were in vain. The bridge was lost, depriving the army of the ability to cross the subsequent water obstacles in an orderly manner. The subsequent breaches in the dam turned into insurmountable chasms filled with icy water and the bodies of the fallen. The Spaniards fell into the lake under the weight of their own equipment and drowned in the deep mud. The column finally split into several isolated groups. Deprived of a common command, the conquistadors were blinded by fear in the darkness of night, unsure of where the next attack would come from. They threw heavy cannons into the water and abandoned their wounded comrades to move even a little faster. But the most terrifying and treacherous enemy for many soldiers that night was the captured gold. The conquistadors, their pockets stuffed with heavy gold bars, sank like stones at the first fall. They could not swim to the surface because of the enormous weight of the plundered treasure and drowned right off the shore. The precious yellow metal for which they had crossed the great ocean was now killing its owners. Greed had turned into a death sentence for hundreds of experienced warriors on the expedition. The Aztecs held a complete tactical advantage, attacking the enemy from their agile canoes. Their vessels swept along the embankment, allowing warriors to pull the Spaniards from their ranks straight into the water. There, the infantrymen were either drowned or taken captive for subsequent sacrifices in the temples. The disciplined army turned into a frenzied mob, gripped by primal terror. People made their way to the saving shore literally over the corpses of their comrades and horses. Dawn on July 1st, 1520, found the few survivors on the mainland. The scene that met the commander's eyes was truly horrific and tragic. Hernán Cortés had lost more than half his force, nearly all his trusty horses, and all his artillery. The surviving conquistadors had no gunpowder left, no food supplies, and no clean drinking water. It was the moment of the absolute collapse of all hopes for an easy conquest of the great empire. Cortés's great campaign seemed to have come to a definitive end in the mud and blood of the Night of Sorrows. The Spaniards stood in open terrain, surrounded on all sides by hostile local tribes. Exhausted, wounded, and completely demoralized, the soldiers simply awaited the Aztecs' final crushing blow. Cortés gazed for a long time at the pitiful remnants of his once formidable army beneath a spreading tree. He could not hold back bitter tears, and this tree would later be called the Tree of the Night of Sorrows. But this tragic story actually had a completely unexpected and dramatic ending. Ahead of the exhausted Spaniards lay a decisive battle in the Otamba Valley against superior enemy forces. It was there that a handful of survivors would have to achieve the impossible and turn the tide of history. After the bloody night of sorrow, the remnants of the Spanish detachment had become the living dead. The soldiers marched north, staggering from hunger and wounds. A barren, rocky desert stretched out around them. They had neither doctors nor food. To avoid dying of exhaustion, the soldiers ate fallen horses and meager plant roots. The Aztecs gave them no respite. Light Indian detachments constantly harassed the column, showering it with arrows from the surrounding hills. Cortés no longer had cannons to drive off the enemy. Now the Spaniards employed the tactics of a cornered beast, short, furious counterattacks followed by an immediate retreat. Every step toward the lands of their ally, Tlaxcala, required an incredible effort of will. When the exhausted soldiers finally crossed the border into Tlaxcala, a decisive choice awaited them. Many demanded that they flee immediately to the coast and leave this cursed land. But Cortés made a different decision. Instead of evacuating, he ordered preparations for a total siege of Tenochtitlan. The mistakes of the past had been taken into account. Now the Spaniards had no intention of walking into a trap without control of the water. In the forests of Tlaxcala, an unimaginable construction project began. Spanish craftsmen and thousands of Native American laborers set to work building a fleet hundreds of kilometers from the sea. They built 13 collapsible warships, brigantines. Every beam, every plank, and every nail was marked with a number. Then something happened that made its way into military history textbooks. Thousands of Native American porters hoisted the disassembled ships onto their shoulders. A massive column stretched for kilometers, carrying an entire fleet over the mountains to Lake Texcoco. It was a crazy but brilliant decision. Cortés was preparing a counterattack that would deprive the Aztecs of their main advantage. maneuverability on the water. While the ships were being built, Cortés' diplomats traveled to the surrounding cities. They offered the Indians a simple choice: eternal tribute to the Aztecs or an alliance with the new rulers. City after city defected to the Spanish side. Tenochtitlan was losing allies, provisions, and hope. The strategic noose around the capital's neck was tightening. The ability to survive and adapt proved more important than cannons. A handful of people who had survived in the wilderness had transformed into a cold-blooded siege machine. Preparations for revenge were entering the homestretch. In the next chapter, you will see how ships dismantled in the forest put an end to the history of a great empire. While Cortés was building ships in the forests of Tlaxcala, an enemy arrived in Tenochtitlan against whom the Aztecs had no weapons. Smallpox arrived on the continent along with the Spaniards. For the Indians, who had lived in isolation for centuries, a common European disease became a death sentence. The Black Death did not discriminate among its victims. It crept into both opulent palaces and humble huts. The city that had withstood steel swords and cannons proved defenseless against this invisible killer. The streets of the capital were littered with bodies that no one was left to bury. In the very midst of war, the empire began to die out. The disease struck at the very heart of the defense. Smallpox spared neither experienced generals nor ordinary soldiers. Even the new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, who had led the uprising after Montezuma's death, perished. Power in Tenochtitlan shifted so rapidly that the defenders were plunged into chaos. Orders no longer reached the outposts, and the once formidable garrisons on the ramparts were melting away before their eyes. This biological blow replaced an entire army for Cortés. Now the Spaniards did not need to launch bloody frontal assaults. The city's defenders were too weak to attack the Conquistador's camp. The Aztecs barricaded themselves inside their quarters, trying simply to survive amid the epidemic and famine. Cortés' strategy became extremely brutal: total suffocation. He ordered all the aqueducts supplying fresh water to the city to be blocked. The vast metropolis was left without a drop of water under the scorching sun. Hunger and thirst finished off what the smallpox had started. With each passing day, the walls of the great capital grew weaker. The initiative had finally shifted to the Spaniards. The balance of power, which had previously seemed impossible, had evened out. The Aztecs had lost their main advantage, their numbers. The defenders' morale collapsed. They saw the disease as a punishment from the gods and a sign of the end of the world. The invisible virus turned out to be the most effective siege weapon in history. It destroyed the empire's foundation even before the first Spanish cannon fired a volley at the city walls. The fate of millions of people was decided by a microscopic organism. Tenochtitlan was doomed even before Cortés' 13 brigantines touched the waters of Lake Texcoco. The war's finale became a battle of technology against desperation. Thousands of Native American porters carried parts of the 13 brigantines on their shoulders to the shore of Lake Texcoco. Before the astonished defenders' eyes, Spanish carpenters assembled a full-fledged military fleet in a matter of days. The launch of these ships signaled the end of Tenochtitlan. Now, the Spanish ruled the mirror-like surface of the lake. The brigantines, armed with cannons, became floating fortresses. They easily sank hundreds of Indian boats that had previously attacked the dams with impunity. The Spanish fleet imposed a complete blockade. Not a single canoe carrying food or fresh water could slip into the city anymore. Trapped in a vice, the conquistadors launched a coordinated attack from three sides. The Spaniards and their Native American allies advanced along the dams step by step. They immediately destroyed every bridge they captured and filled the canals with stones and earth. Cortés no longer wanted to take risks. He was turning the water barriers into a reliable dirt road for his cavalry. The Spaniards' tactics became frighteningly simple and effective. After capturing another block, the soldiers did not advance further, but began tearing down the houses to their very foundations. Majestic palaces and temples were turned into mountains of construction debris. The Spaniards used these rubble to fill in the next canals, leveling the city's buildings into an empty plain. Tenochtitlan was disappearing, turning into a convenient field for a cavalry and artillery attack. The Aztecs fought for every meter. They turned every surviving building into a fortress, showering the attackers with a hail of stones from the roofs. But courage was powerless against the scorched earth tactics. The Spanish siege machine methodically ground down entire districts, advancing only a few dozen meters a day. The city was suffocating within the ring of the blockade. The defenders ate tree bark and drank salty lake water, dying of thirst and disease. But even in this agony, they refused to surrender. The historical outcome was inevitable. The great capital of the empire was being wiped off the face of the earth for the sake of Cortés' final victory. The largest siege in the history of the New World was entering its final stretch. The final days of Tenochtitlan resembled a massacre in a stone sack. The remaining defenders were pinned against the very edge of the lake. Behind them was water, and ahead, an endless wall of Spanish shields and Indian spears. The city, once an engineering marvel, had turned into a vast mass grave of broken stone and ash. On August 13th, 1521, it was all over. The last Aztec emperor, the young Cuauhtémoc, tried to escape in a canoe but was intercepted by a Spanish brigantine. His capture put an end to this long, bloody war. As soon as the leader was taken to Cortez's camp, the resistance ceased instantly. A chilling silence hung over the ruins of the great capital, a silence that had not been heard here for 3 long months. This campaign proved that iron will and precise calculation mean more than a million-strong army. The Spanish detachment, which a year ago had fled barefoot and wounded along the causeways on the Night of Sorrows, now stood upon the ruins of the empire they had vanquished. They had triumphed not only by the sword, but also through alliances with local tribes, floating cannons, and the invisible smallpox. The old world had collapsed forever. On the site of the ruined pyramids, the Spaniards began building cathedrals, using the very stones from which the Aztec temples had been built. Tenochtitlan vanished, and Mexico City began to rise from its ruins. But the consequences of this victory extended far beyond Mexico. The gold and silver seized in the New World poured into Europe in an endless stream. This wealth transformed the global economy, ushering in the era of global trade. A local catastrophe in a lakeside city marked the beginning of a new chapter in world history. The world grew larger, but the price of this expansion was horrific. The story of the Aztecs' fall is a stark reminder of how fragile even the most powerful empires can be. No walls or architectural traps could save the city when it faced methodical calculation and a fierce will to survive. On the ruins of the shattered dams, the foundation was laid for the world in which we live today. History does not forgive those who remain stuck in the past. The Aztec Empire was great, but it faced a force that knew how to adapt on the fly. The fall of Tenochtitlan served as a harsh lesson. Even the thickest walls are powerless if the enemy is willing to build a fleet in the forests and use nature itself as a weapon. This campaign demonstrated how cold calculation and a fierce will to survive can turn the tide of even the most hopeless war. A new city rose in place of the lake capital, and the old landscape of Mexico vanished forever beneath the foundations of colonial cathedrals. All that remains of the emperor's grand ambitions are ruins buried beneath the earth. The fate of Cortez and Montezuma is not merely a chronicle of conquest. It is a story of how a single turn of the key in the hands of a determined commander can forever change the map of the entire world.